You're listening to the Useful Science Podcast, produced in collaboration with the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center. This week, we're talking about red meat versus the world. Useful Science is a website where we post one-sentence summaries of scientific research relevant to your everyday life. On this podcast, we bring on a rotating panel of our science contributors to pick out a few items from the Useful Science archives and dive deep into them. So while the website gives you the short, tweetable version of scientific research, our goal here is to give you the full story. Let's meet our hosts for this week.
My name is Joshua Jackson. I'm a PhD student in the psychology department at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I study how culture changes over time and the impact of changing culture on human psychology.
I am Jamie K. Devine. I am an associate scientist at the Institutes for Behavior Resources. I work in operational fatigue and performance. My background is in neuroscience.
And my name is Cameron Spencer. I'm not a scientist. I'm a web designer and a web developer, and I work on the Useful Science website. So, Josh, I think we were going to start with you giving us some context around what exactly red meat is, right?
Yes. Well, today I'll be speaking about two lines of research, one that came out in June of this year in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and another that came out just last month in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Now, both of these articles discuss the health outcomes associated with eating red meat. So before I dive into those, I thought I'd just step back a little and discuss what white meat is and what red meat is and what the background to this debate is. So red meat is a cover term for meats that have high myoglobin content. And myoglobin is a type of protein found in meat that has a deep red color. And examples of meats with high myoglobin include beef, lamb, pork, and venison. These are all meats that are red when they're uncooked. White meat, in contrast, refers to lighter colored meats like chicken, duck, turkey, other kinds of poultry. Sometimes people include fish in this definition, but many nutritionists actually don't consider fish as a meat, nutritionally speaking, and they leave it out of red meat versus white meat discussions. Huh. Incidentally, white meat also includes myoglobin, but in a lesser quantity than red meat. And there are a lot of misconceptions about the health benefits and risks of white versus red meat. And in reality, there are costs and benefits to both forms of meat. So white meat and red meat are both similar in protein content, and both are really good sources of protein. Both are also good sources of vitamins, but red meats are much higher than white meats in several vitamins, including B12. And without proper levels of B12, people are at risk for a variety of health issues, and this is especially true of the elderly. Red meats also tend to be higher in minerals like zinc and iron compared to white meats, but both types of meat are good sources of minerals. And red meats tend to be higher in saturated fats than white meats, so they're fattier. And apart from these obvious health facts, many nutritionists and nutritional scientists urge caution when consuming red meats because some observational studies from the past suggest that eating red meat is associated with cancer, especially colorectal cancer. And studies also suggest that red meat can lead to unhealthy levels of LDL cholesterol, which is commonly referred to as bad cholesterol because it blocks arteries and increases the risk of heart attacks. But these claims are really contested because most observational studies don't separate the effects based on different kinds of red meat. For example, someone who eats steak, fresh vegetables, and a glass of water gets the same red meat score in many observational studies as someone who eats a McDonald's Big Mac, French fries, and a Coca-Cola. And so the debate continues, and that brings me to the two articles I'll be discussing today. The first article, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition article, focused more on the immediate benefits of eating different diets, and especially on cholesterol. Now, this was a really big experiment that lasted several months, and it didn't just manipulate meat content, it also manipulated how much fat the subjects in the study consumed. People were randomly assigned to either a low saturated fatty acid diet, so if saturated fat was only 7% of their total energy, or a high saturated fatty diet, and this was 14% of their total energy. And participants didn't know which kind of diet they were consuming. They were just given the foods that they needed to eat over the course of the study. There was a 2-week baseline period where it tested for how well people could comply with their diets. And then people went into the study and they, for several weeks, they ate either this high-fat or low-fat diet. But within the time that people were in the study, they were randomized to be in 3 different types of low-fat or high-fat diets. And one of these involved eating red meat, another involved eating white meat, and the third was vegetarian. And so, for example, if you were somebody who was put in a low-fat diet, For 4 weeks out of the study, you would be eating vegetarian low-fat foods. For 4 weeks of the study, you'd be eating white meat low-fat foods. And for 4 weeks of the study, you'd be eating red meat low-fat foods. Whereas if you were in the high-fat diet, you'd be doing the same 4-4-4 schedule, but you'd be eating high-fatty foods. And there were 2 to 7 washout periods, 2 to 7 week washout periods between each critical diet, where people went back to their normal diet and got used to eating regular kinds of food before the next critical stage. And the experimenters measured LDL, HDL, and total cholesterol in the last 2 days of each dietary cycle. And so this allowed them to keep track of cholesterol after a white meat or a red meat diet, but it also allowed them to keep track of cholesterol over the course of the study for people who were in the low fatty acid or high fatty acid diet. Now, do you guys have any questions about that method before I dive into the results? Because it's a little complicated.
I don't have any questions, but that's because I've done studies where we had to control diet, so this sounds familiar to me.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if there's ethical issues with giving people a diet that you believe is unhealthy.
That is a good question, and it actually comes up a little bit in the next article. Just to address the question, I'm not sure about ethical issues with this particular study. But there are very, very few randomized control trials of high red meat and high fatty diets for that very reason. And so that's what makes this study unique. Obviously, it passed some sort of ethical review board. Perhaps they convinced the reviewers that this study wasn't putting patients in immediate medical risk. But yeah, I mean, it's an issue that's come up before.
And I guess the other question I have is around like blinding. Like if you're feeding people a bunch of red meat, they're going to be aware of that, right? Like, and they have a like a cultural expectation of how that's supposed to make them feel, or what the impact of that's supposed to be on their body.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess there's a couple of ways of addressing that. First, everyone got red meat, and so this wasn't a particular group of people who got red meat and the others didn't. And then also, they didn't rely on self-report measures, so how unhealthy you felt or how much weight you said you gained. They actually took measurements of cholesterol, and so the types of measures that you'd expect to be biased by cultural expectations weren't the focal measures of the study, if that helps.
And you can also get around, it's in this blinding, what you could say to participants when they sign up for the study is, we're going to be manipulating your diet, and you're going to have different diets of food, but they don't have to explicitly say, the point of this is to look at red meat, which usually with an IRB, unless it will affect the results, you have to tell them exactly what you're doing. But you can say more vaguely, we're looking at dietary changes, and then when they finish the study, you tell them we were looking at red meat versus white meat. So you can avoid priming them to thinking about, I've got chicken today, and I know that this is red meat versus white meat, and so I'm probably going to be healthier, and I'm going to use my magic powers to lower my cholesterol.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
that chicken might have come with a side of broccoli or something, and I might wonder if this is about leafy vegetables instead or something.
Right. So they probably were sitting there eating their food thinking, "Oh, today I got red vegetables versus green vegetables. Maybe that's it." Or they might have just been interested in getting paid to eat food and not as nerdy as we all are and sitting around thinking about it constantly.
Yeah, and it's easy to look at the differences across the conditions and think, well, it must have been obvious to people. But we're sitting here reading the article and seeing, these people got assigned to the high-fat versus low-fat diet. People didn't see that kind of bird's-eye view information when they were participating in the study. But there's a related issue, which is whether people drop out because of their diets. And so about more than half of the people who started this study dropped out, and about an equal amount dropped out in both arms of the study, the high-fat and the low-fat diet. And the study does a really good job of reporting all the reasons that people dropped out. So, for example, 23 people left because of time conflicts. 19 couldn't adhere to the diets. So they ended up with a sample of about 113 after starting with over 200. So, I mean, you could think that people are dropping out because of the diet being more difficult in one condition than another, but it doesn't seem that way based on who's dropped out in what condition.
I bet the dietary restrictions where you weren't allowed to have alcohol.
Yeah, I imagine that would be a popular one for dropping out.
Was this the usual group of undergrads?
I am not sure. I don't think this was undergrad, so they don't specify whether this was a student sample or not, but the age range looks to be 21 to 65, so it looks like a community sample to me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, well, I'll dive into the results. The basic takeaway results were that total cholesterol and LDLs, this is the bad cholesterol, were higher in the meat conditions compared to the non-meat conditions. And so if you're eating meat, you have higher cholesterol than if you're not eating meat. HDL cholesterol was also significantly higher, but the difference between conditions was only about a quarter of the LDL difference. And so the real impact was in this bad cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol. And unsurprisingly, total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol were also significantly higher in the high-fat condition compared to the low-fat condition. So taken together, having a meat-based diet and having a high-saturated fat diet were comparable in their effect on cholesterol. In fact, people who ate a low-fat, white or red meat-based diet on average had the same cholesterol and LDL levels as people who ate a high-fat vegetarian diet. So that's a useful way of thinking about it. So if you're eating a really fatty vegetarian diet, you have the same level of bad cholesterol as someone who's eating a healthy meat-based diet, in this study at least. Now, the reason that this study was in the headlines a lot when it came out was that there was virtually no difference between the white and the red meat conditions. They were indistinguishable in the levels of cholesterol and LDL cholesterol at the end of the study. And so a lot of headlines came out when this article was published suggesting that the white versus red meat health debate was overblown. And that takes us to our other article. And it's a little misleading to call this an article because it was actually several articles. It was several papers in a single volume of the journal Annals of Behavioral Medicine, which is a very prestigious medical journal. It's also misleading to call these studies because they were actually reviews of past research. They were trying to synthesize the effects of past studies investigating red meat on health into single statistics using something called a meta-analysis. Now, whereas the last study I spoke about was very precise in the outcome that it focused on, looking at cholesterol, this study was really broad. It looked at a huge range of studies, and it looked at studies collecting data on total mortality, so just how many people died over the course of the study, cardiovascular disease mortality, how many people died from heart disease, cardiovascular disease incidence, total cancer mortality, how many people are dying from cancer, and type 2 diabetes incidence. And they're aggregating over observational studies, cohort studies, and longitudinal studies. And so these studies differ a lot in how their designs are set up, whether they're observing the same people over a period of time or whether they're observing groups of people over a similar period of time. They differ in whether they're just correlating these outcomes versus actually testing using randomized control trials to look at experimental effects. But across the reviews, they find pretty similar results. The largest two reviews, for example, find that reductions in red meat consumption resulted in statistically significant but small reductions in the risk of total mortality, heart disease mortality, total cancer mortality, and type 2 diabetes incidence. For example, one review found that red meat reduction was associated with between 11 and 26 fewer cases of cancer per 1,000 people. And another review found that red meat reduction was associated with 6 to 9 fewer cases of cancer per 1,000 people. And so you can see that depending on the criteria of the reviews, they come to different conclusions in terms of precise numbers. But the general message is the same, that fewer people are dying of cancer or fewer people are dying from heart disease, but it's a small amount. There's only one review that really just focused on experimental studies or randomized control trials where people were assigned to either eat high levels of red meat or low levels of red meat. But it's kind of misleading that it was specifically focusing on meat because this was not an analysis of many studies where people were assigned to eat red meat specifically. They actually just ended up analyzing a single study of about 46,000 postmenopausal women. And the study didn't reduce red meat specifically. Instead, it reduced fat in women's diets. And so this included a reduction of red meat, but the purpose of the study was very different. And so what they found in this study is that there was virtually no effect red meat diet, on risk of cancer, stroke, or heart disease. The effects all showed really small reductions in these outcomes, but none were statistically significant. But again, this was just a single study, and it wasn't specifically manipulating red meat. Before I wrap up, I'm just going to mention that the publications of this second paper has been really controversial. The second series of papers, I should say. So 3 of the authors of the team didn't actually agree with the press release that the author sent out that red meat had no detectable adverse effects on health. And the reason they didn't agree was because, as I mentioned before, a lot of these reviews found statistically significant effects of red meat on increasing risk of heart disease and cancer prevalence and total mortality, but the numbers weren't that big. And so most of the authors thought this wasn't really a big deal, but 3 refused to buy into that story. Another reason that the study is controversial is because it didn't contrast red meat consumption with white meat consumption, and it didn't separate, and many of the studies didn't separate processed from unprocessed red meat. And so this comes into play when we're speaking about the McDonald's versus home-cooked steak dynamic. And final point is that the leading author of these studies, Bradley Johnston, did not report a connection he had to the International Life Sciences Institute, ILSI, which funded his previous research and is supported by McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Cargill, one of the largest beef producers in North America. Now, these organizations didn't fund the paper I just told you about, or the series of papers I just told you about, but they did fund a previous paper that Johnston published suggesting that sugar wasn't as bad as we previously thought. And that is a lot of information. I'll leave it at that, but happy to clarify anything that was unclear.
Okay, so the second series of studies, I think the numbers you mentioned were around a 1% increase in the risk.
Yeah, so it really depends on the outcome and the study, but if we're talking about 10 people out of 1,000, that is a 1% increase.
And that's not 1% of people getting cancer. That's 1% higher likelihood versus the likelihood you would have had already if you hadn't been eating red meat, right? So you already have a percentage likelihood of getting this particular type of cancer, and now that percentage likelihood is increased by 1%.
Exactly.
So if it was 10% before, now it's, or if it was 5% before, now it's 5.5%.
like I said, it really depends. I mean,
I'm mathing badly.
in one of the reviews, the total cancer incidence, it was 18 per 1,000 people, and so that would be almost a 2%. So going from 5 to 7 or something.
Okay.
But in another, it was just 6 out of 1,000. In another, it was 4 out of 1,000. And so all of these reviews had different criteria that they used, and it's really difficult to pinpoint what the true effect size is. But what is important is that all of these effects were statistically significant, and so these were not tiny effects. They weren't effects that we should dismiss immediately, even if it was only 1%.
Right, and that first article you talked about was talking about specific outcomes like cholesterol.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily talking about mortality. So even if they found no connection with these particular outcomes like cholesterol, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no impact on your life expectancy or your quality of life.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a tragedy that the study that makes all these big sweeping claims didn't really have the precision of the study that was only looking at cholesterol. I would have been really interested in what the randomized control trial I spoke about that just looked at cholesterol would have found if they had surveyed other kinds of outcomes like well-being, for example, or weight. But it's really difficult to run these studies, I imagine, and so you really have to pick your targets. And some things like diabetes, even if you have a study that lasts several months, that's not long enough to really meaningfully see these things occur.
So do we have a consumer takeaway from all this?
I've been thinking a lot about that, and I think that it kind of leaves us where we started. There are some really obvious drawbacks of eating red meat, especially associated with cholesterol, but it doesn't really seem to exceed the drawbacks of eating white meat, at least based on what we know. It just seems that when you eat meat, it's a good source of protein, but you're going to have to come to terms with the fact that you're at a slightly higher risk of cancer, you're at a slightly higher risk of total mortality, and you're at a slightly higher risk of diabetes and high cholesterol. And I think that it speaks to the value of a vegetarian diet, as long as you make sure that you're getting vitamins, minerals, and proteins from supplementary sources. I think that if you eat a low-fat, meat-based diet, if you're concerned about health, then that isn't the end of the world. It's just really a shame that these studies don't often separate processed meats, like the kind that you'll get at a fast food store, which are really what people caution about when they give nutritional advice.
Okay, well, that was so well summarized. Thank you, Josh. But leads great into the set of articles that I have to discuss.
I'm so excited for this.
Drumroll. Okay. So when Josh said he wanted to talk about this article or this topic and was saying, okay, who wants to talk about this with me? I said, hey, I'll do it, but I got to let you know. If we're talking about red meat, I'm going to be talking about climate change and what is the impact of red meat and your diet on sustainability. And he was like, all right, fine, whatever. So I started looking into articles to get a really good idea, not just something you heard on Facebook, but what are we really looking at? And similar to the set of articles that Josh was talking about, I found so many different reviews and different papers saying different things. So what I've chosen to sort of use to summarize this topic is a paper which is a review of methods for figuring out diet optimization. So this is Mathematical Optimization to Explore Tomorrow's Sustainable Diets, a narrative review. It's by Gazan et al., and it's from the journal Advances in Nutrition. It's a 2018 paper. So first of all, diet optimization, what is that? Well, that is a whole diet approach that combines metrics to figure out the dimensions of a sustainable diet. So it's not only going to be nutritionally adequate, but it'll be economically affordable, culturally acceptable, and environmentally respectful. So the best diet for all of the reasons, not just one of the reasons. So they go through and they discuss what mathematical optimization is. This is also known as diet modeling, diet optimization. And this mathematical approach to figuring out what's the best way to eat started in the 1940s. And it sort of started out of economic reasons. How can you fill all your nutritional needs on a budget? And more recently, and the authors say, probably because we've discussed affordability, we've discussed cultural acceptability, we've discussed nutrition. So recently everyone's focusing on, well, what about environment? And this article goes into, it is a review of 67 relevant original publications that used mathematical diet optimization to help understand links between the different dimensions of a diet's sustainability. So that, not all of them do environmental impact, but all of them at least discuss nutrition and culture. And then many of them discuss also affordability and environmental factors. And one of the things that is sort of prevalent through all of these is the difference between observed diet and optimized diet. So the diet that you're seeing in a group of people versus what would be the best possible diet given these constraints. And I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of the math, but what I really liked about this paper is that it discusses all the different ways you could parameterize these 4 dimensions. So, well, what do you mean by cultural acceptability? What do you mean by affordability? What do you mean by nutritional value? And what do you mean by environmental value? And the two that are most interesting are nutritional value and environmental impact. So if you use a model that just looks at calorie intake and says, what's the most sustainable diet for calorie intake? Well, the one that's best for the environment is just high sugar foods, and there's no nutrients. So that's not actually optimized. And similar to some of the articles that Josh was discussing where, well, now we're talking cancer risk, now we're talking this risk, or even in that clinical trial or that controlled trial where they were looking at cholesterol, I'm sure some of our listeners at home are going, well, okay, that's great. You're talking about cholesterol. What about iron? Who was anemic at the end of that on the vegetarian diet versus the red meat? What about all the other things that are important for your nutrition? Were they getting enough vitamins? Were they getting enough vitamin D, vitamin B12? So depending on which article you look at, they can have different results because red meat is better for some of those nutrients than others. And so that led me down a wormhole. So this paper that I'm talking about now, Mathematical Optimization, this is very many pages long. And their discussion pretty much says this set of statistical tests.
Could you say that if we're optimizing just for environmental concerns, we would eat a bunch of sugar?
Pretty much.
Just high sugar foods, I guess, because it's just calorie dense.
Right. If we're talking calorie density per environmental impact. And I'll get into that in a little bit because they don't discuss that in this paper, which is what sent me down at a wormhole. And I have two supporting papers that represent the 24 papers that I rifled through to get here. Okay, well, so the math, they said this started in the 1940s with the simplex algorithm, which is the backbone of linear programming. And today, optimization takes other forms in linear functions, such as quadratic programming, mixed integer programming, or goal programming using multiple objectives. And they cover all of those approaches. I don't think most of our listeners would prefer us to get into the math of it. I think they want us to stick to the meat of the topic. So I'm not going to get into that or the kinds of software that they have, because they mentioned software that is designed for optimizing diets in third world countries and that take into account, can you grow food here? Or what is the availability of these nutrients? And choosing which foods to include in your model. So if you include foods that in your mathematical model that you can't actually get in that place, then that doesn't give you a real world solution. So in the end, they say, there's a lot of these. And if you are trying to look on the internet to find, which is the best diet, then you can really sort of take your pick, and it's all going to be based on how did they model the math. So what did they choose to include as important when they were trying to figure out what's best? So for the first paper that Josh discussed, that would be cholesterol. And for the second set of papers, it would be diet and mortality and cancer risk. And for environmental reasons, they usually just go with greenhouse gas emissions. So that seems to be the easy answer. And they go through a list of studies where in the UK, minimizing greenhouse gas emissions without nutritional constraints except for energy or calories, led to a diet high in sugary foods and sweetened beverages and low in meat, fruit, and vegetables.
Wow.
Yes. And then in other ones, depending on the country, like introducing constraints to account for food habits led to a healthy and environmentally friendly diet with 52 food groups achieving a 36% greenhouse gas reduction from baseline, while diet cost decreased by 12% in the United Kingdom's average 2009 household spending on food. Then they found some in France where they were able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 70%, but that one really changed the diet so that large reduction in meat, fish, eggs, substantial reduction in fruit and vegetables. Italy, the United States, they go through all these different studies and optimization models that come up with different results. And then, well, what do they mean by nutritionally adequate?
So Jamie, is the idea that like if we were going to like practically apply this, that a computer would tell me what I'm eating today? Like, is that kind of what we're like is that the idea that like algorithmically determining what our menu should be?
So it's not really personalized like that. So usually this would be done by like the USDA. So the USDA would run one of these models, and then they would update their guidelines based on the results. So they would say, here's 52 food groups that we recommend. Here's what we recommend. And for third world countries where you're trying to figure out affordability or availability, that it's something that's not really run by an individual. It would be run by an organization.
We're talking about like the food pyramid.
Yes.
Yeah. Which I know is not considered good science these days.
Right. And so what's, I suppose, nice is that governments are utilizing these models and trying to figure out, and there are organizations that are trying to use mathematical modeling to determine, what is the healthiest, cheapest, most sustainable diet for our people, but also one that they're really going to adapt to. Yeah. So cultural acceptability is something that they talk about in this paper at great length, and I think that is easily summarized by referring back to Josh's paper, where so many people dropped out because they were like, no, I'm not doing this diet. Screw this.
I kind of have a related question to Cameron. Jamie?
Mm-hmm.
So this paper sort of presumes a lot of things, like we know the impact of certain diets on greenhouse gas emission, or we know the impact of certain diets on health. And I wonder if you can just, if you came across this, if you can speak a little bit about exactly how eating red meat or white meat or any meat translates to higher greenhouse gas emissions. Because I get this question a lot when I mention to friends and family that I was doing this episode.
Thank you. Perfect introduction. So I found that I found my question unanswered there too. And so I started looking around and saying, okay, well, who's going to really address this? And who's going to tell me, like, what does this have to do with beef? What does this have to do with meat? And the best one I found comes with caveats. So this is sort of an editorial in the Journal of Food and Nutrition. And this is from 2018 as well. It's written by Donald Layman. It's called Assessing the Role of Cattle in Sustainable Food Systems. And Donald Layman, PhD, is the Professor Emeritus at the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And his research focused on protein and amino acid metabolism. However, Dr. Layman also is a speaker for the National Dairy Council, the Beef Association. He's a consultant for a couple food organizations, and he's received funding from the NIH, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as Kraft Foods.
So a lot of interests competing.
A lot of interests, but I thought his take on this did a very good job of summarizing the answers we're looking for. So the first thing he says is we're trying to figure out this diet, environment, health issue, and it's usually just summarized by greenhouse gas emissions. And first, let's understand, okay, well, so how much greenhouse gases are being contributed from agriculture? And the claims are between 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions up to, some of them say it counts for less than 9%. And United States farmers have demonstrated that modern agriculture is more efficient than we're used to. So not only is it sort of undefined how much agriculture is contributing to the overall issue of greenhouse gas emissions, but then when you break it down into each individual crop or stuff like that, it gets more complicated. So he says, whenever people are discussing the impact of food on sustainability, they just go greenhouse gas emissions over calories. And yeah, when you do that, you get more calories with less greenhouse gas emissions when you raise grain versus livestock. But a point that he brings up that's really one I don't think a lot of people thought about, and I didn't, is there's only so much land in America that you can use for growing grain or crops. There's a lot of grassland, and grassland only grows grass, and only certain animals can eat grass. And those animals are ruminants, like cattle, sheep, or goats. So it's not a simple substitution. You just can't take a ranch and instantly convert it into some place where you raise wheat, for one, but then you'd have to raise more diverse crops, such as soybeans, quinoa, something with more protein, in order to get it anywhere near the kinds of nutrients that we get from meat.
Ruminant. That's a new word for me. Ruminants are mammals that are able to acquire nutrients from plant-based food by fermenting it in a specialized stomach prior to digestion, principally through microbial actions.
So they're not animals that make mistakes and then really think about it for a long time and get down on themselves.
They're not ruminating. Yeah.
Well, they chew on it, right?
They're fermenting in their stomachs. That's wild.
So I guess my follow-up question is, and this is maybe one that you haven't found in your research, but are all ruminants equally bad?
Nope. So there are different amounts of greenhouse gases produced by different ruminants. So buffalo produce slightly less than cattle, but then within cattle, dairy cows produce a different amount than beef cattle. And this is where it really gets interesting. Cows produce different greenhouse gases in different countries. And the efficiency of raising these livestock is different across different countries. And so he makes the point that Brazil has more than 220 million cattle, but that U.S. EPA reports greenhouse gases in the United States are 9% from agricultural, and dissected further, it's 4.2% from livestock, with 2% from beef, 1.4% from dairy, 0.5% from swine, and 0.1% from poultry.
I'm looking at some of these graphs myself right now, and it's kind of crazy how beef seemed like so much worse than the others.
Yeah, and I think they're not the same across all animals. And one thing that this author didn't discuss in his editorial was, what would the reduction be if we switched from cattle to bison, or if we switch from cattle to sheep? And that's something I think Ted Turner has gotten onto, like, hey, buffalo, let's do buffalo. And it's not a huge decrease. Then the point that Dr. Lehman does make in this article is that American farmers have done such a great job of making their beef more efficient. So when you compare our production and how much we get in dairy or meat for the greenhouse gases produced, it's so much lower than Brazil or India or New Zealand, where they're raising other cattle. What he doesn't mention is why. Like, all right, how are you getting more milk out of your cow? How are you getting more meat out of your cow? And that we've discussed way back in the day with regards to organic meats and hormones and stuff like that, and he just glosses over that. And the statistics he gives from the EPA, well, that's a 2017 EPA. So if you're already paranoid about cattle and environmentalism and information, you might not be inclined to believe a 2017 EPA report, since there were a lot of changes to the EPA's funding and infrastructure since 2016. he moves on to say, people say, okay, well, we can get the nutrients we need from plants. We don't need to have meat. And then he discusses how you get those nutrients from soy milk or from other beans or peas or soybeans. And he makes the point that the bioavailability is not as good. So even if you're eating something that has protein in it and has some of these amino acids that your body needs, your body can't pull those amino acids from a bean or a pea as efficiently as it can from a piece of meat. Which led me further down the whole wondering, are you really underfed? Are you malnutritioned if you go on a vegetarian or vegan diet? And that brought me to this third paper, which summarizes a lot of the information I found looking through another half dozen papers. So this is comparison of nutritional quality of the vegan, vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, and omnivorous diet. And this is from the journal Nutrients, and it was published in 2014.
Pesco being fish?
Pesco being fish. So the first thing it says is everybody is interested in diet quality. No one's actually gotten a lot of data from vegans. And so they set out to do that. And they recruited people for this study. And this study was, you filled out a questionnaire online, and they had a very comprehensive questionnaire. How many times do you eat? What do you eat? And things like that. And then they ran analyses to see, is it fulfilling dietary needs? And to get these participants, they had a collaboration with the Ethical Vegetarian Alternative and Thursday Veggie Group. And so this was all based out of Belgium. So these are Belgian groups that are pro-vegetarian, because they figured if they just put an ad on the internet, they wouldn't get enough vegans because they're somewhat rare. Haha.
Are you a vegan, Jamie?
I am not a vegan. I do get mistaken for a vegan frequently.
I just thought maybe the haha.
No, rare, because
it's a
rare meat.
joke.
Yeah.
Oh, it went right over my head.
No. It's okay. No, I eat everything. But when you eat everything, and you're not picky about food, that doesn't stop me from ordering vegan. Because a lot of people, they might eat vegan meals because it's all they can eat, and it's not as appetizing as others. But I'll eat literally anything, and I like weird, interesting things. So I often will order a vegan meal, and I do get frequently mistaken for some sort of vegan or vegetarian.
I went to a vegan restaurant in Phoenix a couple weeks ago, and I had a vegan pastry that I was convinced was not vegan because it was so good and like so flaky, so delicious. But it, sure enough, it was vegan. And then I had a red bean quesadilla with tahini on top that I'm still thinking about today. It was like the highlight of the trip for me, that vegan quesadilla. It was so good.
Well, I do know, I have some vegan friends. I do know what vegan food is, and I know how to make it. I know how to identify it. And you would be surprised by some things that are vegan, like Pillsbury. Pillsbury crescent rolls.
Wow.
Vegan. And so that brings up a point that a lot of people sort of suspect when it comes to veganism, is that when you limit yourself from any animal products, you are replacing those products with chemicals or with gluten. One of the vegan restaurants in my neighborhood where I used to live would serve fried gluten. That's not health food, but it's vegan. Okay, so they recruited a whole bunch of people. They were at least 20 years old. They were living in Belgium, and they got 1,475 people in this study. Now, 3 out of 4 people were female, and 50% of them were younger than 30. They had 104 people who were vegan, 573 who were vegetarians, 498 who were semi-vegetarians, 145 were pesco-vegetarians, so they eat fish but they don't eat other meat, and 155 were omnivores. So one of the things that they did that I thought was funny is they asked people to self-identify, but then they gave them this huge questionnaire. So the questionnaire was the food frequency questionnaire and a diet questionnaire. And if someone said, yes, I'm vegan, and then they go through this whole diet questionnaire, and it says, do you drink milk? And they go, yes, I do. Then they would classify that person. So they didn't kick them out, but they say, there were people who thought they were vegan and they don't qualify as a vegan. Same with vegetarian. Some people are like, yes, I'm vegetarian except for bacon. And so they compared all of these results to the Healthy Eating Index, which is a degree to which a dietary pattern conforms the official guidelines summarized in the United States Department of Agriculture Food Guide Pyramid using a 10 to 12 component score. And they also compared it to the Mediterranean Diet Score, which uses 10 components to express the agreement with the Mediterranean diet pattern by 7 desirable and 2 undesirable components, and 1 moderation component. So if you, like Cameron, don't trust the food pyramid, they compared it to a different food scheme as well.
I am right, though, aren't I, that the food pyramid's been debunked?
Well, it's been replaced.
Been replaced.
They don't do the food pyramid in America anymore, and they update these nutritions, but that sort of gets back to the mathematical optimization paper I was talking about, where you can argue that a diet is sufficient or not if you use different models. So what sorts of things are you including for importance? So in America, it's not as important for you to get most of your calories through grains or something. And they changed it from a pyramid to a healthy plate. So now it's no longer, you gotta get all the stuff on the pyramid. You have to fill your plate with fruits and vegetables and grains and meat or a protein source. So that's something that I think they also changed because in America we don't have problems with getting sufficient nutrition. A lot of times it's about choices. So people are mistakenly eating an unhealthy diet that adheres to the pyramid where, they're getting enough nutrients from spaghetti. They don't need to carbo load, stuff like that. So they went through here, and here are the results. And they did find that this was a very healthy population. So it's healthy, it's high educated, it was mostly female. And they say, this might not be extractable, but this is what we've got. So vegans had lower calorie intake than other diets. Vegetarians also had lower energy intakes, but they were getting enough of other stuff. So they had prudent diets, which means they were meeting these scores. So the vegan diet had the highest total score for the HEI, which is that Healthy Eating Index. And the omnivorous diet had the lowest score. And then within that, they found empty calories were highest for vegans and lowest for omnivores, which is sort of in contrast, but that the vegans were obtaining the amount that they needed. So they had the most restricted diet, but better fat intake. They had lower cholesterol, lower saturated fat, higher polyunsaturated fat, which is related to good cholesterol, lowest protein, and highest dietary fiber. But their iron intake was good, and it was the most favorable for vegans, which I found surprising. I would have thought that you would get better iron intake from omnivores, and they were getting enough protein. So I think the findings here, now they also say they didn't account for vitamin B12 or vitamin D, but a lot of times those parameters get dropped because you can take supplements for that. So I think something that this study and all these other studies we've been discussing and the problem in general is you can make a healthy diet if you're vegan, if you're meat eater, if you're a vegetarian. You can make a healthy diet and you can get a sustainable diet across the board, but you have to be smart about it. It's not going to come naturally. So if you go on a vegan diet and all you eat are Pillsbury Crescent rolls, you are going to be malnutritioned. But if you have an omnivorous diet and all you eat are processed meat products and processed foods, you are going to be malnutrition. And it seems like, frustratingly, you just have to pay attention to what you're eating in order to optimize how sustainable your diet is. But what's nice about this is so this paper suggests that you can live on a vegan diet without sacrificing your nutritional needs. And vegan diets seem to be related to better health in a lot of situations and also related to greater sustainability. So there are some models that say a vegetarian diet where you're allowed dairy or something like that, that might be more sustainable than vegan because it takes advantage of those grasslands that you can't convert. Some say just vegan is better, but those might not take into account the fact that if you stop eating meat, you can't just turn that grassland into a soybean field. Another example that they say is if you're going to cut back on animal products, let's say you continue to drink 2% milk or skim milk, but you don't drink cream or you don't use cream. Well, cream is a byproduct of the production of that milk. So you're not saving anything. You're just not eating something that's made anyway.
Yeah, but you feel a little more righteous.
So I guess on the plus side, you can go vegetarian, you can go vegan, and you can still get all the nutrients that you need, but it's going to be harder and you're going to need to work at it. And they don't talk about the absorption and how it's different when you try to absorb nutrients and amino acids from a bean than from meat. Because our bodies, we are designed as omnivores. We are designed to extract these proteins from an animal.
When I was doing the research for this episode, I came across a few of the graphs that you were alluding to, Jamie, about greenhouse gas emissions by animals, and the cattle bars were really shocking to me. And actually, for the last 3.5 weeks, I haven't been eating red meat just for that reason. And I don't know if it's something that's going to stick, but I think that the more that I research this, the less sure I am about what steps I should take with my own diet, because I think that you've summed it up perfectly, that you can have a healthy diet while being an omnivore. On average, vegans seem to have healthier diets, but also you're putting yourself at a higher risk for not having certain vitamins, minerals, protein. And so, I don't know what's going to happen moving forward, but I think that this has left me just as even more kind of confused and doubtful than I was when I first started researching for this episode, when I was blissfully ignorant.
Right. Well, and there's got to be someone, you're halfway to work, you're sitting in the car listening to this podcast, you're not getting out because you're like, are they gonna bring this up? Are they gonna bring this up? Come on, guys. So, of course, one of the reasons that our listeners may be interested in the environmental impact in beef is because the Amazon rainforest has been experiencing a number of fires lately. And those fires have been attributed to ranchers trying to clear land, trying to clear trees to make grazing land for cattle. And so this isn't about methane farts, because of course you can't talk about how cattle impact our environment with greenhouse gases and not make a methane fart joke.
Do you know that cows actually release more methane from burping than they do from farting?
Well, yeah, but farts are funnier than burps.
Yeah, but isn't that crazy? That was crazy to me when I first learned it.
Right. So, and that's because they're fermenting. And there's ways that we could adjust that. Microbiome has been suggested if we change their microbiome, they wouldn't produce as much methane gas. That would be an area where if we switch to a different ruminant animal, even though they're fermenting that grass, it wouldn't be as methane-y. And of course, Dr. Lehman in his editorial mentions that, there were about as many cows in 1800 as there are now, but there are way more cars. And so if we're thinking, where can we limit this? Probably cars are doing more damage. But back to the rainforest, independent of what the animal produces and how much the animal itself impacts the environment, the ranchers, and depending on what your government allows ranchers to do, has been impacting our environment in Brazil because it's leading to forest fires in a rainforest, which is known as the Earth's lungs. And some people say, forest fires, they happen. Forest fires happen, and they have been happening. And the fact that you read on the internet that a forest fire happened doesn't mean that this is all of a sudden the end of the world. But there are other people who are saying, well, we know how forest fires happen, and this isn't normal. So that's an aspect of this that hasn't even gotten into what does this mean for our ability to eat meat. And Dr. Lehman's editorial points to, we'll just need American meat, because the American cattle have been turned into the most efficient cattle possible, and you get so much more milk and so much more meat out of them per environmental cost or per rearing cost. And then you have to wonder, well, how did you do that? So it's something you can argue it on many sides. And none of these articles or any of us got into today. We're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, not even water consumption or, what are pesticides doing to the environment. And there's so many more environmental issues beyond greenhouse gas emissions. So you can easily get overwhelmed.
Well, that was super helpful. I found that really really clear and informative, Jamie. Thanks for doing so much research.
But I like this sort of stuff. Now, one thing I do want to say, because, and this is a shameless plug, and I'm not getting paid by anyone to say this, but I have an app that I use to track my energy consumption. So it's sort of like a diet app, except it tells you how many proteins, how much fiber, all of that stuff is broken down, how many your calories you need, and then I can sync it to my Fitbit so it accurately records my activity as well. And I love this app. I think it is so great, and it doesn't give you diet tips. It allows you to change if you want to lose weight or gain weight or maintain weight, but it doesn't push any of that. And also this app allows you to indicate if you are a pregnant or lactating female, which many apps don't do, and no one tracks that. So you can see if you're getting enough calories and nutrients for making another person on this app. And it's called Cronometer.com. So CRONMETER. Cronometer. So you can get it for your phone. You can get it on a web page. But what I really love about this app is that it breaks it down into what kinds of amino acids are you getting. So you look in the protein file and it says protein, this is what you got. This is how much leucine you got. It says how much fat you got and what kinds of fat, saturated, unsaturated. Are you getting enough calcium? Are you getting enough iron? If you were going to, after listening to this episode, try to tackle your own diet optimization, it's a very good website for doing that. And I've been using it since I was breastfeeding my son and have been using it since then. I'm now 8 months pregnant, and I've been using it throughout this entire pregnancy and changed over from regular lady to pregnant lady. And I've been very happy with the results. And I'm someone who plays around with apps and plays around with health stuff and diet stuff, and am so into healthy stuff that I get accused of being vegan. So this one I have found to check all those boxes.
I find all this stuff rather overwhelming. I was thinking about, when we were talking about like trying to weigh the environmental impact of our food, I was thinking about the show The Good Place. Did you guys watch The Good Place?
I don't, but I know it.
Okay.
No, I haven't seen it either, but I know of it.
Minor spoiler alert coming for The Good Place, so listeners, fast forward 3 minutes if you don't want to hear this, but they discovered that in the last many decades, nobody has gotten into heaven, and it's because of the world's become so complicated that there are unintended consequences to everything that we do. Because, you buy this certain thing because you think it's better for the environment, but, what about like the impoverished person that had to pick it in this foreign country or whatever. So yeah, when we start trying to weigh these externalities to our daily actions, it becomes pretty overwhelming pretty quickly, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I first got introduced to the concept of Malthusian vegetarianism, and I'm not sure if that's really a term that most people use, but Malthus is a philosopher who first sort of recommended eating less animals to sustain a larger population of humans. And I had some friends who were vegetarians for this reason, as opposed to usually people are vegetarian that I have met because they love animals, and it sort of offends them or turns them off that we're eating something so cute. But these people didn't care that it was cute. They just wanted to sustain a wider population. And my husband and I are from rural Pennsylvania, and we eat Scrapple. And they came over to try Scrapple, and everyone's thinking, either there's people who go, yeah, Scrapple, yeah, been waiting for someone to bring up Scrapple for every episode here. And there are other people who are going, is that a board game? So Scrapple, if you've ever seen the original Rocky movie, where he's working in a meat house and he's scraping the floor and there's just meat garbage on the floor, that's pretty much what Scrapple is. It's parts of the animal they were gonna throw away, but they decided to make like a meatloaf out of it.
I eat hot dogs.
Yeah, so hot dogs are a step above Scrapple.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so these friends came over and they were like, well, we'll eat that because it's trash. Literally, it's meat trash.
Where do you buy Scrapple? Do you just go to the butcher and say, just give me what the floor has?
Yeah, do you have to collect it yourself?
You don't. You can make Scrapple yourself. I have made Scrapple myself. It's complicated and it takes a while. So I live in Maryland right now, and I can get Scrapple at Target because I'm so close to, where Scrapple is made and where it's common. But Cameron, you're on the West Coast, so I have no idea where you would get it. I don't think it exists out there.
There's probably some artisanal Scrapple I can find somewhere. The shops around San Francisco.
It's true. And I mean, if you go to a butcher, maybe they know where you can get it.
So is it like a sausage? Like, what are we talking about here?
What format?
It's like a hash brown that is made out of meat. So you get it and it's like a brick. And you slice it up and it tastes like the inside of a sausage. But you slice it up and then you have to fry it or bake it. So you can't just eat it raw. You have to cook it in some manner. And it's somewhat difficult to cook because if you cook it wrong, it just crumbles and it no longer has its brick-like consistency or sausage patty-like consistency. So it's difficult to prepare unless you are really used to it, and then it's second nature to you. And it tastes like the inside of a sausage, and it's got the consistency of like mashed potatoes that have been fried on the outside.
Okay. So that's why it's good for meatloaf. You keep it together.
Well, it's its own little meatloaf. So it's you can't like add it into something else. You could probably put it on pizza.
That's making me hungry.
Really, that description? It's like the trash.
It's not making me hungry.
The trash on pizza, though.
It was when you said it came from the floor is the part that turned me off. I'm sure that's not literally true.
Well, it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't come from the floor, but it is pretty much like if you've seen the movie Rocky, you're looking at him scraping the floor, you're like, that's Scrapple. And then the show Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe, he did a episode where he worked in a Scrapple plant. So if you really want to know how the sausage is made, you can watch that one.
Well, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback or any questions for us, you can email us at podcast@usefulscience.org. You can also find us on Twitter @usefulsci, and you can find us on Facebook by just searching for us. We have a subreddit, which is /r/usefulscience, where we post the show, so it's a good place to comment there, or comment on any other things that we post, or post your own things. I want to thank our editors from the Moorhead Planetarium, Vivian Lee and Samantha DeColi. And I want to thank the composer of our new theme music, Solomon Krauss Imlach. My name is Cameron Spencer. You can follow me online @usonic, on Twitter, that is, @usonic, EUSONIC.
My name is Joshua Conrad Jackson. You can follow me at Josh_C_Jackson on Twitter.
My name is Jamie K. Devine. You can follow me at JK_Devine, DEVINE, on Twitter.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a very useful week.